JRPGs, Japanese role-playing games. This term is so nebulous that I'm really not even sure where to start with this video. I want to back up enough to give context to these games, but I don't want to go so far as to actually try and define what an RPG is, because that just sounds like a bad time. For right now, and for the purposes of this video, let's just say that an RPG is anything with a leveling mechanic, because I think that's pretty fair. That being said though, you take JRPG at face value and you're left with a range of games spanning from Bloodborne to Mario and Rabbids Kingdom Battle. Oh wait, Ubisoft's based out of France, isn't it? Regardless, taking the literal version of this title and trying to apply it doesn't really make sense, so what we're left with is using how the word is used to try and figure out what it means. This is something that happens in the English language all the time because it's so decentralized and non-standardized that people just kind of use the terms that stick, and if it means something important enough, then the word will stick around for a while. In practice, when we talk about JRPGs, we're really talking about games that are tied together by a similar aesthetic or by their story elements, not by some defining feature of their gameplay. Now, this is a subsection of the RPG genre as a whole, so some gameplay elements are common throughout most games, but there's a wild amount of experimentation with the gameplay in this subgenre. So much so that I won't hesitate in calling this the most diverse genre in modern video games. Speaking broadly, you can break up JRPG combat systems into two main groups. You have turn-based combat and you have real-time combat. Turn-based is up first because it's the type that the progenitors of the genre used when JRPGs were first coming out. I'm not going to talk about those games though, because obviously nothing made before the year 2008 matters or is important at all. Series like Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy that popularized this style got better and more refined as they evolved, so I'm going to talk about their more recent installments instead of rehashing discussions about classics. I'm also going to neglect talking about tactics RPGs like Fire Emblem and Valkyria Chronicles, even though I think Three Houses definitely fits the bill for a JRPG status. Come on, you fucking... God damn it. Whatever. What was I talking about again? Oh, okay, yeah, so in my opinion, when it comes to turn-based combat, Dragon Quest XI's Echoes of an Elusive Age Definitive Edition for the Nintendo Switch is goated. It's got that tried and true formula, that timeless 4 assholes standing in a row setup. Each character and enemy has to wait their turn to perform an action. You're in direct control of each member of your party, so you have to think about how their actions can play off of each other. You can run around the battle arena a little bit, but positioning doesn't really matter all that much, and there are a varied amount of actions that each character can perform, from attacking, to healing, to placing a buff on your party, to placing a debuff on the enemy. You have a lot of options here, most of which scale up in intensity as you get further into the game. Dragon Quest XI, etc. isn't in the title of this video though, so I'll move on to the next style of combat in JRPGs, the real-time combat. I think the biggest distinction between turn-based and real-time is that in real-time combat, players don't have to wait for another character to stop acting before they do. In other words, as soon as a battle is started, any character can perform any action at any time within the constraints of their own moveset. This is where the bulk of the support is for my statement earlier that this is the most diverse genre in modern video games, because each series that falls into this category plays completely differently. And more often than not, even games between the same series have radically different combat systems. Due to their unique nature, it's hard to compare these games, but even so, I think it's even harder to argue that the Xenoblade Chronicles games aren't pinnacles of this style of JRPG combat. The way they stack ability after ability on top of each other and place such an enormous emphasis on positioning and timing, it's just so satisfying. Taking a step back though, I think what these real-time combat systems are best at, and what they all have in common, is fostering those coveted when it clicks moments. Alright, I knew this was coming, and I knew that I couldn't make a video like this without broaching the subject, so here it goes. Alright, I know that grinding is a bit of a contentious subject. Some people love it and some people despise it, but in my opinion, grinding is really only inexcusable if the system that you use to grind isn't deep enough to support and sustain long-term experimentation. I think most JRPGs craft their combat systems to work with that specific goal in mind, keep the player consistently engaged throughout the entire game, and I've seen both turn-based and real-time combat systems accomplish that goal. Some of the statements I've made so far might not sit right with some people, but I'm not entirely sure why. Every single combat system that I've shown so far, with the exception of Bloodborne, requires time and experimentation to get the hang of. Half the reason why I get excited to play these types of games is that I know I'll be spending a majority of my time figuring out how to properly operate and optimize the combat system. Well, of course, that begs the question, what's the other half, right? I feel the need to put a light spoiler warning here, especially considering how some people can get triggered depending on what information you show about a game. But I'm not really sure if a spoiler warning is warranted. By now, I think it's pretty apparent that I'm not really going into very much detail about the things that I'm talking about. And there's a reason for that. If any of you guys are interested in seeing an in-depth analysis of either the combat or the story elements of any of the games that I've shown so far, please let me know, because I'd really love to talk about them more. And most of them do deserve their own distinction. Alright, story time. So, in this specific aspect, JRPGs used to be the top dogs, and in some respects I'd argue they still have some great storytelling moments in them, but I'd be lying if I said that Western games, and specifically Western RPGs, aren't rapidly catching up and in some ways haven't surpassed JRPGs for the position of the go-to narratively driven experience, even if most of them draw on already fleshed out source material. Looking at the main stories of most JRPGs, you can see that they're decidedly less unique, even between series, though there are some notable exceptions. In most, you're a plucky young protagonist with lofty ambitions who meets a cast of characters that become your inner circle of friends, and you band together in the face of a seemingly insurmountable evil, ultimately overcoming it with the power of double spinning X. These stories are also convoluted as hell. I'm not going to sidestep that at all. Look, these games are 100+ hour games. You're going to need a lot of plot points to keep some level of momentum or intrigue going the whole time. This is where I think these games benefit a lot from having a large cast of characters, especially since most of the side characters in these games are more interesting and more deep than the central protagonist. Though again, that's not always the case. It's easy from the outside looking in to dismiss JRPG stories as some over-the-top anime bullshit. And I kind of see it. There's a lot of anime bullshit in these games, I'm not gonna lie. They're full of strange Japanese weirdness and over-the-top camp that can be really alienating to some people. Not least because of some subpar voice acting and horrible translation.
Behold the mighty Zeke von Gembu, bringer of chaos! Mostly known as Zeke, and often addressed as the Zeekinator!
Oh, fucking gets me every time. Ugh. But if you're willing to look past it, I'd argue that this is a surface level issue. It's when they pull that rug out from underneath you and deliver some seriously heavy moments that these games reach into the realm of brilliance. JRPGs have a knack for dealing with huge, daunting issues like death, justice, and human relationships with a surprising amount of nuance. These issues stand out even more considering the over-the-top environments and set pieces that accompany them. Alright, that's about as far as I'm willing to go without getting into actual spoiler territory, but before wrapping up this section, I do want to shout out Tales of Vesperia. If you're skeptical about what I'm talking about in terms of story nuance, I don't think there's a better game that exemplifies this than Tales of Vesperia. The game deals with justice and the value of a human life in a way that little other games I think would even dare to touch. Even though it's a great example, my main point here is that it's not an exception. Even the most cut and dry JRPGs deal with these heavy introspective moments. I think I've made it pretty clear at this point that the JRPG genre has some of my favorite games in it, and I'd argue that it's important for these games to be appreciated, if for no other reason than the sheer amount of originality that lies within them. These games aren't perfect, only a fool would argue that, nothing but Tetris is, but I would argue that JRPGs are far from the bottom of the barrel when it comes to modern video games. Let me try to illustrate this point a little bit by letting you in on a little secret. I extremely dislike 2D platformers. I've never had the patience for them, and I rarely go out of my way to play one, but I would be a fool if I said it's the worst genre out of all of them. It's my least favorite, but it's definitely not the worst. Yet that's the kind of insult I hear lobbied at JRPGs all the time, and I gotta say I think it's pretty unfounded. I don't know, maybe I care about this too much. Alright, I definitely care about this too much, but I don't know how you can say that JRPGs are the worst genre when dating sims exist.
Thanks.
That doesn't count.